Merci beaucoup d'être venu jusqu'à nous, d'avoir affronté la chaleur torride.
Despite the scorching heat, which is even worse than last year, we could think that we're in New Delhi, India. We have a wonderful round table. You are fully right to be here. We are going to talk about globalization in Age of Uncertainties. That's the topic of today. There were so many people wanting to speak up that we have actually 6 high-level guests, and we actually thank them. Isabelle Méjean, you're an economist, you're a teacher at the Sciences Po Institute. You're the one moderating this roundtable, and you're going to do an introduction. Then we have Mrs. Nger Woods. You are at the Blavatnik School of Government and you're dealing with economic governance. Tabatha, you're actually the president of the Canadian Council for Indigenous Business. You're one of the most influential people of Canada, according to a recent survey, so hats off to you. Also, Sigrid KAAD, you are the previous UN Special Coordinator for the Middle East peace process. You were actually a Minister for Trade in the Netherlands. Sportios Maltos, you were the General Secretary of the Youth Program at the Mexican Council on Foreign Relations. You're also an analyst, and thank you for being here. And also, Mr. Philippe Maillard, you're actually the General Manager of APAV in risk management. You have 600 employees, and your analysis will also be very precious for us. So Isabelle Méjean, you take the floor so that you can make an introduction on this wonderful subject. Thank you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your attendance at this roundtable on a subject which is at the very heart of the news. As you know, next week, it's the end of the suspension as granted by the Trump administration as for the customs tariffs. Will have so much to do on international trade, and we have important negotiations to enter into on customs trade, and this will hamper international trade towards the US. So when we talk about tariffs, they stand at 10% for all exports towards the US right now. Next week, potentially, they will stand at 34% for goods exported by the EU to the US. And so we will go backwards 70 years ago as regards free trade after the Second World War. That's the level of tariffs that is very high that we are going to reach. And this will have an important economic toll on the economy. And we'll have this problem for several years looking forward, because it's always very difficult to go backwards once this type of decision has been made regarding customs tariffs. Also, it will be difficult, and there will be a lot of uncertainties in terms of international governance, because it's very complicated. Today, the WTO functioning is encountering headwinds. The founding member is the US, and they have stopped complying with the rules of multilateralism. They have also stopped funding WHO, and they have also decided to put the whole settlement body in a dead end. So it is a very complicated situation, and the question will need to be addressed. The following question will need to be addressed. What about international governance after WTO? As for tariffs, we have entered an era of a lot of uncertainties regarding economic politics. To give you an idea, there were some researchers from Stanford universities, and they actually assessed the political uncertainties. We have reached 3 times more uncertainties in terms of level what we had before. So that's actually a very high level, and this hampers the functioning of our economies. This has an impact on our economies, and the functioning of businesses is very sensitive to the environment and the infrastructures. We'll talk about it later. We have seen that the industry will be hampered, and this will have consequences on investments that is necessary for environmental transition, and that will actually lag behind in the years to come, and this will be very complicated. We are also going through a period where we have a lot of important questions that tackle other types of world governance. We have had a strong increase on insurance risk premium. That showed that the American political, commercial politics has a toll on the sale of goods and the funding of the US economy. And these risks go beyond the EU-US economy because the international system relies on American infrastructure and the sales of goods to the US. So ahead of us, we have a financial crisis. Another element, and we've seen it in the last weeks, that's a risk weighing on international relations. Donald Trump has repeated several times that the commercial politics had also diplomatic ambitions. The aim was also to pay entrance to the American market, but also to pay for the security as granted by the US within NATO. And we have heard several calls from Donald Trump to NATO partners to increase expenditure for NATO. What we also have seen, that's the American intervention on Iran. They said that they were ready unilaterally to take decisions that could have consequences on world order, and that would oblige the rest of the world, including the other G7 members, to take decisions and to make compromises that would be very difficult. This is all the consequences that would weigh upon world order and the world economy, and we'll discuss this now. Thank you. A round of applause, a round of applause. Thank you, Isabelle Méjean, for this wonderful introduction and this recap that is very interesting. We are in a world where we're not talking about smooth trade, but rather brutal trade. Our governments are more and more violent and brutal as well. So what we want to ask to you, who is an expert on the governments, what are the new rules of the game in this new world filled with uncertainties?
Wonderful to be here in Aix-en-Provence. So what can the rest of the world do, and what are the new rules, as you asked me? So I think the first thing is to understand that order is not broken. So the first thing the world is doing is saying, without the United States, the whole post-war international order is broken. And I think that's wrong, and I'd like to just tell you why for a moment. But equally, what I see now is government after government queuing up in an orderly line to supplicate with President Trump, while the bureaucracy and the government take a wait-and-see position. And it's not really wait and see, it's wait and hope that this will pass. And that's understandable, but it's not enough. So I'd like to just very briefly say why there can be order without America, and what it is that governments can do instead of defensively waiting for another tornado of executive orders and tariffs, as Isabelle mentioned in her introduction. So many of us grew up in a world where the US was at the core of every international institution in the Western Alliance during the Cold War, and which it's stepping back from. But what we haven't paid enough attention to are all the other institutions that flourished outside of the United States and that are still flourishing today. Next week, the BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa will host their summit in South Africa, in a continent which itself has all kinds of arrangements, the Andean Fund, different development banks within the region. In trade, where the United States has for a decade been blocking the appellate body that decides whether trade rules are being obeyed or not, 52 other countries without the United States have gone their own way and created a mechanism to do the same. So my first message is, it is possible to build, create, and sustain order without America. The second point I want to make is that America and the American economy is very powerful, but that power is far less than it was a decade ago and is being eroded as Trump uses the power it has. So first, the power of America as hegemon began eroding after the global financial crisis. Just take one example, finance, where instead of countries queuing up for the IMF as they used to, they now have about 3 different lines of defense. They've built up their own foreign exchange reserves. They've built different regional arrangements with others. They've signed up for bilateral swaps with a number of countries, not just the United States. And all that means that there are many more lines of defense and they're less dependent on the US-built system. So we've already seen that happening. We've seen the rise of countries keeping other currencies as their foreign exchange reserves. But now what we're watching with President Trump, with the measures that Isabel mentioned, is a president who, by using American coercive power, is eroding American power. Let me give one example. America is the only country in the world that can print as many dollars as it wants. Why? Because the rest of the world demands those dollars. The rest of the world buys them and uses them. What do they buy them and use them for? First, for trade. Well, with all the tariffs that have been mentioned, that trade is going to start reducing. Second, they buy them to hold them as foreign exchange reserves, and they buy US treasuries. But this is an administration that has even toyed with the idea of unilaterally restructuring foreign investors' holdings of treasuries and of dollars. And third, it's an administration that talks about talking down the dollar. Why? Because President Trump sees the world's use of the dollar as a burden on America. President de Gaulle, many years ago, called it America's exorbitant privilege. And you can see it has elements of both, depending on where you see it. But what we can see for sure is that every other country in the world is dependent on America at the moment, but will most certainly be less dependent in several ways by the end of the next year, 2 years, 3 years, and 4 years. I've talked about the economy. We could say the same on security, where the security treaties that enabled America and its markets to flourish have now been put into question. Countries will find their own different arrangements. So the US looks very powerful now, but its power is eroding. So what I want to just finish on is, what does that mean for every other country? It means stop waiting and seeing what the United States does. Work out what your own country's interests are. Forge those arrangements with other countries and work as hard on that as you're working on your relationship with the United States. That's not happening yet, and that needs to happen. And this country, France, and this region, Europe, needs to lead in making that happen. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you for this strong speech, and it's very inspiring. So France should take the lead. Tabatha, I would like to ask you this question because the magic word has been pronounced, Donald Trump. That's at the heart of our discussions, undoubtedly. You know Mark Carney, who's the Prime Minister of Canada. You've met with him recently. You were member of the Economic Council of Justin Trudeau, and so at the heart of the economic decision in the Canadian power. What can you tell us about the discussions that take place right now between the America of Donald Trump, which is very aggressive towards Canada and your country?
Miigwech. Yeah, so I, in January, was asked to sit on, at that time, Prime Minister Trudeau's Canada-US Council, a group of representatives from the business community. And at that time, we were definitely a wait and see, responding very quickly. It was a very public conversation. The Prime Minister Trudeau was very public about sharing conversations that were happening, and we were definitely responding very quickly to every tweet and social media message that came out from the US administration. With our election and our new Prime Minister Carney, things have definitely quieted down from a very public perspective, which is very different than the last time we negotiated NAFTA into what we have now as our CUSMA. That was very a public negotiation that was happening. And while we're still not to the point of renegotiating our CUSMA agreement, which is to be in 2026, there has been a lot of conversation about what these conversations will mean for that negotiation, and a lot of conversation about the perspective of should we be moving faster on renegotiating that agreement. So currently we are 25% on border goods, 25% on auto vehicles, but not parts, 50% on steel and aluminum, but very different whether it is melted or forged. So the uncertainty that's, I know we'll talk about this a little bit, the uncertainty that's bringing to the business community, both from like small, medium enterprises to our large manufacturing, has definitely continued to increase the anxiety. But a little bit of like us not seeing and reacting so much has helped to temper the business community's anxiety and a bit of their stress level. But we do know from those conversations, and this council is really for us to be able to understand what conversations are happening between the Prime Minister and the President, and also for us to provide input and feedback into what we're hearing from our members. We know that there has been a auto manufacturing plants that did not work at all, did not produce a single part for one whole day, and that has not happened in decades. So we're already seeing an impact on auto manufacturing within the country. I think the interesting part about the conversations is that trying to track the rationale. So is it fentanyl? Is it security? Is it defense? I'm sure you're feeling the same in Mexico. Right now, we're definitely hearing that is a lot more around defense. So Canada is responding with respect to our spending on defense. But to put a bit of that into action about how we're looking within our own country, also looking at how that defense spend is going to be able to be spent in Canada. So what are we doing in Canada to shore up our manufacturing? What are we doing to ensure that people aren't able to offshore steel and aluminum that typically would be going to the US, cheaper steel and aluminum, but that we're ensuring that we're having our own procurement and shoring up our own procurement so that we ourselves can be part of the solution to the defense spend. We just happened to meet on Friday afternoon with the Prime Minister and had a good conversation, waiting for our date is July 21st, hopefully to get somewhere on negotiations. Not did we like hit the end button on our Zoom call and the tweet went out about the digital sales tax, and that was a very like negotiations. President Trump said negotiations were done with Canada. That was definitely, in my thinking of how that meeting went, a complete surprise. So there are definitely some things that I think conversations are happening between the President and the Prime Minister of Canada, but that definitely came as a surprise to the Canadian government. But I think that the difference is it's a new Prime Minister, and what might have been Prime Minister Trudeau's priorities are not necessarily Prime Minister Carney's priorities. So was the going and saying, okay, we will not implement the digital sales tax, not necessarily capitulating. It really was about how do we stay at the table and keep negotiating. And we'll see what happens from there. I think just a little bit to put into context, we all understand that the US will always be likely our major trading partner. About close to 70% of Canadians live within 100 kilometers of the US border. I think it's over 90% live 200 kilometers within the US border. So while we are doing the work to build up our trade agreements with the European Union, we had some, Prime Minister Carney had some very good conversations about that with respect to minerals a couple weeks ago. We also, as a business community, need to understand that tariffs are likely going to be part of our future. And how can we get to the most minimal impact of where they are? And that means ensuring that we can keep the negotiations open. I think I'll leave it for there.
Merci, merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your well-deserved applause. Raquel Lopez Portillo Maltos, we're lucky to have you also. And you have also traveled a long way to be with us under the ex-sun. And as a member of the biggest idea laboratory of Mexico on international affairs, of course, we would like to ask you what the position of your country is in the new global game, and with this very big, encumbersome neighbor, America, because Mexico is also trying to have stable trade relationships with China. So what is Mexico's position today? And what are the challenges that Mexico must rise and meet?
The invitation, it's a pleasure to be here with such distinguished panelists. And to answer your question, I think that to understand Mexico's position in this new global disruptive order, I think we have to know that it's kind of a paradox, because on one hand, Mexico has become more relevant than ever. We are now the United States' main trading partner with over 800 billion in bilateral trade just in 2024. So this means that every single day, there's around 2.2 billion worth of goods crossing our border. And I guess I'd like to set an example of how intertwined our supply chains are, because with only one car being assembled in a plant in northern Mexico, this means that it would have to cross from 6 to 7 times across our borders before it's ready to sell. So I think this kind of highlights, and it's not exaggerated to say that the US, Mexico, and Canada not only trade with each other, they build things together. And as Tabatha was mentioning right now, obviously this interdependence that was supposed to bring resilience and development right now is kind of coming to an end. Obviously with Donald Trump's new policies, and particularly with the USMCA, I think this treaty is becoming a battlefield of its own. And obviously President Donald Trump is trying to use it and to use this 2026 review process as a tool for economic coercion and political leverage. So where does Mexico stand in this process? Right now we're facing a very different situation than what we faced when it was initially negotiated. Right now we are going through this anticipated review, because even though it's coming next year, it's already basically under process. So we need to negotiate certain conditions that don't belong to trade issues. So we're talking about containing fentanyl traffic, securing our borders, and of course trying to align with Trump's policies in the industrial sector and in security as well. And while this thing isn't new, I mean, putting security and drug trafficking and immigration in the same bundle as trade, it definitely comes through another lens or through another perspective with this new change of government and with Trump's second administration. Because when it was initially negotiated, Mexico explicitly used immigration as a bargaining chip to maintain these trade talks alive. So what our government did was basically take control of the immigration process and to deploy our National Guard to the country's southern border. And that way, it would benefit Trump, and it would allow the US government to turn the other way and avoid meddling in issues such as human rights violations, violence against journalists, and other kinds of disputes, even energy trade disputes, for example. But right now, I think it's difficult to understand what our bargaining chip will be, since immigration control is not enough and the threats are getting worse and worse each time. And contrary to Canada, I think that the current Mexican government, President Claudia Sheinbaum, is taking a defensive stance, not reacting and waiting for reciprocal tariffs. And on the contrary, she rapidly switched to kind of make the US government more tranquil in terms of having a longer or a more profound vigilance of, for example, Chinese imports in Mexico, or to secure the border and to participate in more extensive security operations for fentanyl. But I think this can buy some steps of goodwill. We don't know if this really works with Donald Trump, but definitely we are having a strategy that's more based on deference rather than reciprocity. So that's really hard when it comes to one of your main trading allies and partners. And even as Mexico is trying to contain this front, obviously Washington is setting its sight on what's happening not only at the border, but also on our ports. And that brings me to the second front, which is China. Because over the past decade, and particularly over the past 5 years, there has been a surge in Chinese presence in terms of capital and investment in Mexico. Just so that you have an idea, in 2024 alone, Chinese foreign direct investment reached $700 million, and Chinese companies operating in Mexico surpassed 1,200. So I think this is really important, not in terms of numbers, but in terms of strategy, especially considering that some of these Chinese firms are using Mexico as a platform to avoid US tariffs and to enter this trade process through the USMCA. So obviously that has raised a lot of alarms in Washington, and there's a lot of clauses being discussed. But I think that to conclude, this is a great example of how Mexico, for the North American case, but really as part of these connector economies, which are sort of getting in the middle of this global trade war, and they haven't really picked any sides, are gaining more importance, but are also gaining more exposure. And if we try to think about a solution of what comes next, I think we have to acknowledge something, which is that this is not a rivalry between strangers. This is a rivalry between main allies which share borders, which share workforce, infrastructure, supply chains, and that really set the tone for what comes next.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your encouragement. We can see each of the countries that we're talking about today, Mexico, Canada, European countries, they're all at a turning point, and they're in the obligation of rethinking the way they work. Cedric KAAD, I would like to ask you the question. What should Europeans do to come out of these difficult times, to come out of this stronger? And are they doing this, and are they doing this sufficiently? What should be done?
I would like to refer and underline a number of the points that Ms. Woods made. First of all, we have to assume alliances are no longer what they used to be. Secondly, fragmentation is a given, and we've spoken about it for quite some time. The choice is ours. We have to deal with China as an economic giant. It will surpass the US in due course, and it's obviously here to stay. It's not the arrival of China. China is here. and our dependency as Europe has been exposed, not only through COVID, but in the periods afterwards. We have another inbuilt vulnerability, and we just have to look in this room, it's demography. We are an aging population, and productivity is not what it used to be and hasn't been for quite some time. At the political level, to my mind, we need to invest big time in reforms, but reforms with teeth, both of the WTO, whilst at the same time pushing the WTO through the plurilateral arrangements that are currently in place. But I'm a bit cautious to want to be part in the undermining that takes place by the opt-outs that the US is pushing for. And isolationism is not unique to the Trump administration. It's a little bit on trade that actually preceded Trump. It's just been exemplified, I think, and accelerated by Trump. Secondly, politically, we need to re-energize the UN. It's the biggest multilateral system. It's a platform for global public goods where you can have a conversation. But it also means, sorry, France and England, you need to have one European seat at the Security Council. It's not credible to pretend that the world since World War II hasn't changed. Power has shifted, money has shifted, and the global south wants to engage in a very different way. NATO, on security, we really now need to forge ahead. We've committed to the 5%. No one is clear how it's going to be financed domestically. It implies serious choices and trade-offs. Are you going to invest in the defense industry, but it's going to cost you in social welfare? Are you going to invest less in education? Or, let's say, sensitive topic in France, in pensions, or the age at which you can retire? All these are matters we need to discuss. But we also need to invest and create the regulatory systems whereby the defense industry, the scaling up of the productivity that we need to have can actually take place. Within NATO, a European pillar that is meaningful and real. When it comes to our competitiveness, at the moment we've rested on our laurels. But a step back, I think we need to reduce our dependency on external actors without getting paranoid, but more industrial screening and investment screening can be both a protective measure but also an encouragement to leap ahead. Competition needs to be adjusted. We've spent a long time, and I speak from a country that often fears industrial champions, even though we have ASML, from France or Germany. When I was Minister for Trade and Finance, when the suggestion is made to have industrial champions, then we have this suspicion that, oh, well, it will benefit the bigger countries. Potentially so, but you can organize that. You can introduce legislation and regulation, and you can have an open discussion if you are serious about the EU being more in today's world than only the single largest market, because even that market will subsequently be under threat. We need to look at investment in R&D. We talk about it. Now, ironically, we have a huge opportunity to get the best minds from the US. I know France and Canada and others and the UK, I believe, are offering. But let's do this as a European Union. And do not, for instance, forgo and pretend there's a trade-off between security on the one hand and investing in the green energy transition on the other, because it's related to the future, it's related to security, and it's related to economic growth. Migration, I know, always difficult, but we are an aging continent. We need different types of skills. We need to replenish the workforce, and somebody is going to have to pay for the collective pensions. Last but not least, follow the Draghi report. It's pretty clear. Now, it's hefty, and parts of the European Union is working on that, but it speaks in a way to massive joint investments. I'm a fan of Eurobonds, but I'm also mindful of the fact that countries within the EU, the Eurozone, have high levels of indebtedness. You cannot speak only Eurobonds and ignore your indebtedness domestically, because it will not incentivize others to want to burden share with you. We need a cutting-edge industrial policy of the 21st century, harmonized regulations. Now, I'm sure the business sector will speak of the red tape and the delays and the slowdowns they've encountered, and decision-making efficiency at the pyramid, at the top of the pyramid of the EU, and of course, no more unanimity in everything, because it doesn't work. And if I can just take a step to a serious crisis in the world, I've just come out of the Middle East. I served at a horrendous war, under a horrendous war in Gaza between Israel and Hamas. And I'm telling you, Europe is not the place we look for political guidance. Never ever. If you want pressure, if you want a decision, and if you want to actually talk about risks, but it's coming home to roost in Europe. So let's reverse the slow agony, and I take a quote by Draghi here, and safeguard our social and green model, but it takes political courage. It requires real leadership. It requires even the willingness to lose elections over it, stand up to populism, and ultimately, to my mind, Europe is still and has to be about norms and values. And that brings me back to a multilateral system comprised of Bretton Woods, UN, an outlier NATO. We have to stand for something, and we cannot be intimidated. We are not to be subjected to predator capitalism or weaponization of tariffs. We are bigger and better than that, but we have to dare, or oser, oser, as I think I learned from the French. Thank you.
Merci.
Thank you very much. Thank you for all of these proposals. And I think that most of the participants in this roundtable will enjoy commenting them afterwards. But it's the first magic word was Donald Trump, and the second of the Rencontre Lex was the Draghi report. And I'm sure that we will be speaking about this a lot tomorrow. That's at the heart of many discussions on our continent this year. Philippe Meyer, let me turn to you. You are the man of risks. Your company is probably today one of the only ones to benefit from the uncertainty, because companies from across the world are turning to you and asking you for advice as to what should be done. I would like to know how these increased uncertainties have affected your clients, and I would like you to give us some very concrete examples of how your customers adapt, maybe by rethinking their production chains or doing something quite different. Philippe Meyer, it's over to you. Thank you. Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm delighted to be here. It is true that the tariff war has really brought some uncertainty to many companies, in particular industrial companies. I would like to recall that all service companies which have local players in the countries are not really concerned by these consequences. So it's really the industrial companies who've developed supply chains that are extremely elaborate, extremely complex, with parts that sometimes come from all four corners of the world. And so we've brought an additional layer of uncertainty to all of this. There had already been a first one with the pandemic. We forgot this. But when I look at these two events, there are two important characteristics that motivate companies today. Firstly, this theme of risk management is coming important again. So it seems quite banal to say it. They are not always very glamorous subjects, assessing risks in a company. But today we can see that the company's boards, the audit committees, the executive boards are taking hold of this theme and looking in their companies, whatever the size, to see what risks they must face and which ones they can prepare for. Because the very first reaction is that systematically when something bad happens, people say, why didn't we foresee this? Well, why didn't we plan for this? Well, we can't plan for everything, but we can prepare or imagine certain solutions. And I think that's very important. So I can see a lot of requests from companies that wish to be supported in assessing and implementing concrete actions to manage these risks. The second theme, in particular, is for supply chains, and these are needs for assurance and confidence. So they want us to help them to assess the vulnerability, the robustness, the strength of their supply chain. So what does this mean concretely? Well, it means going and auditing suppliers. Over the past 2 or 3 years, we've had a multiplication of 3 of requests for supply audits that are either on the other side of the border or the other side of the world, in order to assess their capacity, technical capacity, product quality, systems and ethics, if they're able to rise and meet these challenges and have the necessary flexibility. So these are very concrete requests. There's a need for reassurance and evaluation, audits, suppliers audits, supply chain audits. These are themes that are, grouped all in one pot to some extent. But what they're saying is, help me to give to give confidence to my employees, my customers, my clients, on my capacity to adapt and adjust. So that's a big demand today, to be able to assess and to send teams or to have teams in the different countries. When we're an international group, we can meet these needs better. So it means we need to understand the situations, and there will always be things that we don't understand. The geopolitical risk, well, for dozens of years and hundreds of years, it's always been there. We know very well that certain countries are, you know, due to the government, political choice and regulations, and there are coups in certain countries. So, but you know, on the industrial level, we see a lot of interest to be better prepared, find the alternatives, and be less dependent on others. And I would just like to underline the fact that the question of tariff wars, for me, that is just the second step after the pandemic. It really puts the spotlight on the vulnerabilities or complexities, or maybe the extreme over-optimization of supply chains that have been developed. And all of the problems of just-in-time, I bring in a part from Korea, another one from China, another one from Mexico, and I put it all together in France. But maybe today, this just-in-time and this extreme optimization should be revisited, reassessed, should be made less vulnerable. And this is what we're seeing. It's a demand that is not easy. Of course, the big groups are the first to take on this battle, but they're also asking their subcontractors, their suppliers, to engage in the same type of process and be less dependent and be more apt to respond to these challenges. That's what we're concretely living through. And this demand has been multiplied by 3 in the past few years. Thank you very much, Minute Fire. I wanted to ask a question to Isabelle Méjean to react to what you've just said. What are the economic consequences, inflationist and impact on employment of this evolution? Do you see it at the macro level? Because everything that Philippe Meyer has just said means higher prices for consumers and difficulties for new economic players. Yes, indeed. And the economists no doubt have a lot to say about this, because we have already drawn lessons from the first China-American trade war. The first Trump presidency was marked by this trade war, which was more circumscribed because it targeted China. But it does give us some hindsight on the statistics, which means that we can compare our economic models with the reality of statistic effects. So what we saw in the first trade war was, first of all, that contrary to what is repeated by Donald Trump, the tariffs are paid by the consumers of the country that is imposing the tariffs. Donald Trump keeps repeating that foreign companies will pay these tariffs. But actually, in the context of this 2018-2019 trade war, that was not the case. The tariffs were fully paid for by the American economy. So what is the extent of the cost in the current environment today if we look at very high levels of tariffs from the United States with regard to major economies in the world? We're looking at losses of constant GDP, of real consumption for consumers, that vary slightly depending on the level of the tariffs and on the countries, depending on their opening up to the American market. But to give you an idea of the scale, for the European Union, these are losses of consumption between 0.5 and 1.5 points of GDP, which are constant. It doesn't seem a lot, but when this is indefinite, these are net losses of GDP that accumulate. And the last element, which is one of cost, it's a little bit less well assessed with our models, but once again, it's the consequences of an international order that is far more uncertain, and which makes decision-making by companies very difficult. And this is why companies are turning towards companies that are specialized in risk management. Here, the economic cost is very difficult to assess, but to give you an idea, what we estimate today is that at the time when China joined the WTO, all of the commercial gains with the United States is linked to the fact not of a drop in tariffs, because when China joined the WTO, China already benefited from the same tariffs as the rest of the other members of the WTO. But the integration of the Chinese shock, as we call it in the literature, comes from the fact that thanks to its joining the WTO, China was able to be guaranteed that it could benefit from low tariffs constantly. And that's what we call the clause of the most favored nation. And once China joined the WTO, it could constantly benefit from this clause, whereas before it joined the WTO, that clause was voted each year by the American Congress. So it shows the potential impact of the lowering of uncertainty for companies, in particular in the industrial sector. This certainty, the stability of economic policy, has a value that is very important. And therefore, the political uncertainty that was created today around the operation of the international trade system is a very high economic loss. I would like to come back also, thank you very much, to the way in which the states are positioning themselves. And ask this question to Mary Woods. You said that the states, one after the other, are queuing up to the Oval Office. And everyone's trying to obtain through negotiation with Donald Trump a little bit more than the others. But we don't have the impression that they're getting anywhere. And the political leaders that are playing this game end up by just being humiliated. So I wanted to ask you, isn't there another option, which would be to negotiate as a group and maybe outside of the traditional frameworks, maybe not necessarily the European Union with itself, but it could be alliances between developed countries that have the same interests. We can talk about the European Union, Japan, Canada, you're there, Mexico. A lot of countries would have interest in negotiating together faced with belligerent America. Is that a possibility for you?
This afternoon from both Canada and Mexico, why that is so difficult, because they have immediate short-term interests that they have to go and secure by speaking with the White House. But certainly they need at the same time to be pursuing those other deals. At the moment, I think in many countries, it's as if you have one boyfriend out the front of the house roaring on his motorbike, and that's the United States, and you've got to keep him entertained. And at the back door, you've got your nice, sensible boyfriend who's there with dinner and groceries, and that's China, who in every country is there saying, we will give you stability, certainty, and arrangements. And so what we're seeing is a genuine competition, and I just want to say, I do think we must take into account what Philippe said about what we're losing when we inject uncertainty. If we're going to combat climate change, we need a whole lot of copper. If you're going to produce more copper, you need to persuade companies to invest tens of billions of dollars. They will not do that if they think that the tariffs will change every day, that the permitting will change every day, that their markets will change every day, that the government will be capricious. And that affects not just jobs, livelihoods, and international relations. It also will end up affecting the climate. There's a lot at stake.
Merci. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. I would just like you to react to Mrs. KAAD to a Connick's question. Earlier on, you gave an overview of the situation in Europe today, and if we listen to you, there's a lot to do. Of course, we understood that, but on the way in which European countries are negotiating currently around this specific question of tariffs, what do you think? Do you think that they're negotiating the right way? Do you think that they are sufficiently well aligned? And if you don't think that, what would you suggest they do?
Hard to second guess because I don't know the details of the package and I do not know the extent of the negotiation. But I'm a little bit worried that Europe is a little bit too meek and mild. And it's always good, again, also sometimes to be passive. But to my mind, the other side sees everything as a win. And the winning is the name of the game. It includes humiliation, and it is short-termism. It's not based on alliance. It's not based on an entente or a new configuration of the world. That's why I used consciously the word predator capitalism. And everything is a transaction, and a transaction that can be exchanged. So our viewpoint of negotiations is perhaps not the strongest. So indeed, we have to sort of maybe mitigate the short-term impact, but plan for the longer term. And here, time is of the essence. That means generous financing upfront, embrace the risk that comes with that, and stop being the frugal lot here. I'm saying, at least I come from a so-called frugal country, but I was not known as a frugal minister of finance, because I believe in investing for productive, future-oriented growth, including combating climate change. But we need to do, as Neri said, both at the same time, but it requires unity, it requires unanimity, and the scale amongst the European countries, I fear, again, risks sort of kowtowing. And then you also have another inherent risk, which is a trust deficit that comes with insecurity and instability, but the trust deficit fed by populist, extreme right-wing politicians that actually are in cahoots with the types of voices we hear across the pond, is not helping rational, evidence-based decision-making. And that's a challenge for most moderate parties, and that sets us back. Let's face it, Brussels nowadays is sort of thrown in the realm for some citizens as if it's some alien entity that is working against your interest. But we only have Brussels as a collective if we plan it, if we can explain it, and do not negate the social impact of some of the decisions. That's going to be our toughest call, to balance both. But I'm worried. The good thing is, only the European Commission can negotiate on trade agreements. That's a good thing.
Merci. On le voit donc Europe, France.
Thank you. We see it, Europe, France, Mexico, Canada. There's so much to do. Same thing for the businesses as well. I would like to take a few questions from the floor. If you have some questions to ask to our excellent panelists, the people on the front row, please hand him a mic. Very quickly, please, because we don't have a lot of time.
There are a lot of tasks for Europe. But how can we do these difficult things by keeping the governance, the political governance, the institutional setting of Europe? Do you think you should change it?
Qui veut prendre cette...
Who wants to answer to that question? Mrs. Khan? My name is KAAD. It doesn't matter.
Change it. And there are many practical proposals on the table. I'm not quite sure if this commission is ready to leapfrog, but I think member states need to be willing to really go for shared sovereignty in the biggest possible way. But I'm very pro-Europe. So.
Question ici.
Question here. Dominique Mockley.
And I'm also the founder of a European Center for Globalization. So I have a question for you. You said you have two boyfriends. You have one at the front door and another one at the back door. But let's imagine Europe is a boyfriend. What you would like Europe to be?
Okay, so no, I don't have two boyfriends, but you're offering me three. So what I think most countries in the world wants is relationships with every major power, with China, with the United States, and with Europe. And for most countries, that's going to be essential. So I think it's going to be any country that decides to put its entire future in the hands of the United States at this moment is probably making a pretty high-risk decision. A lot of countries feel that same way with both Europe and with China. And I think here in Europe, we tend to think that Europe feels safe for other countries. Not so. If you go to some of Europe's former colonies and you say, gosh, Europe could lead in a new global order, they say, no, thank you, we've done colonial and we'd rather not. So I think all three.
Écoutez, il reste 40 secondes.
We have 40 seconds left. And so maybe we can have a quick question. You have 33 seconds, so very quick. For Europe's sovereignty, there's also the matter of budget. We are about to vote the next budget. There are going to be a lot of problems. How can we vote a good budget law? How can we have resources with regards to the current constraints? So maybe the economists will speak. In 11 seconds, that will be hard for me to answer, but it's an important issue. This is why we need stronger European institutions and a more affirmed political will. Okay, let's get to the job. Thank you. You are so numerous. That was wonderful. Thank you.